Hello youth, here is your video lesson on percent of a number. Your goal is that you can calculate any percent of a given number. So this is very helpful as a consumer to know when you're reading or when you're in the store and it says we're going to get a percent of something to figure out what that means, and you have some methods to choose from. Okay, so in this lesson and kind of throughout the unit and going forward, you'll recognize this. The word of is going to mean to multiply, is going to mean equal. If you think about when you're looking for a percent of a number, you're really looking for the part in which that represents. So we know that a percent is something out of 100. And so you're going to be looking at, if you're looking for a percent of a number, so say I get 70% on a quiz that's out of 10, that's the same as 7. So you're looking for what percent of the total, what do I get? Okay? So there's two methods for us to figure out the percent of a number. One of them is to write your percent as a fraction and then to multiply, and the other is to write your percent as a decimal. So we know that fractions can equal an equivalent decimal and can equal an equivalent percent. That's from way back when, Unit 3, that we can write equivalents of those. So you can use whatever you feel best about. So if we were going to look for 5% of 300, estimating is a great way to start, right? I know that 5% isn't very much. And maybe I even make the prediction that I know that 10%, I remember, is moving my decimal one place. So 10% is 30. So I could even figure out half of that for 15. But let's do the actual math and make sure that we know how it works. Estimating is great, and using 10% is great also. So 5% I can write as a fraction. Here's what I know about 5% is the same as 5 per 100. And I'm looking for 5 hundredths, or 5% of, remember multiplication, of 300. Great thing here is I don't have to multiply across, I can cross cancel. So I'm looking for 5% or 5 hundredths. Well, if I can figure out 100 goes into 300 3 times, and I'm looking for 5 of those hundredths, well, 5 times 3 is 15. So just like I predicted up here, I get 15. With a decimal, you can do another strategy also. So remembering changing your percent to a decimal. Since I know that percent is the same as per 100, I know that's the same as dividing by 100 or moving my decimal 2 places to the left. So 5% is the same as 5 hundredths. So what I'd really do as a decimal is just take my decimal, multiply that by 300, and you can do long, write out the algorithm for multiplication or use a calculator here, and I'm also going to end up with 15. So saying it out loud then, find 5% of 300, that means that 15 is 5% of 300. And again, we decided 5% isn't very much. 15 out of 300 would then be equivalent to 5%. So if you were to simplify those fractions. So again, this whole thing is just going to be making connections based on what makes sense to you, based on what you know about the equivalencies between fractions, decimals, and percents. Math is not scary if you take the time to focus on what you do know rather than what you don't know yet, and guide yourself through your previous knowledge. So there's going to be a lot here for you to try. I want you to kind of pick, what do I know, what do I not know, thinking about what strategy is best for you. Sometimes I use fractions, sometimes I use decimals. It really just depends on what's in front of me. So for this first one, 10% of 50, well, I know in my head that 10% is the same as 1/10. And I know that looking for 1/10 of a number is really just moving the decimal, divide by 10, one place to the left. So for this one, that's me showing my thinking, but that one's kind of automatic for me. I know that 10% of 50 is 5. Okay? Maybe take a second to pause and come back and try some of these. And then you can come back in and check on how I did them and see how you did. So again, I'm going to use sum with decimals, sums with fractions. 40%, I know that's the same as 4 tenths. I could do 40 hundredths, but I think tenths is easier for me personally to work with. So I just simplified it a little bit, not all the way. So then again, now hopefully we're remembering cross-canceling makes more sense to us now when we realize I'm looking for 1/10 of 120, which is move the decimal one place, which is 12, and I want 4 of those tenths, so I want 4 12s, which is 48. 35% of 90. So here, maybe I decide to use my decimal. Maybe I decide to do 30%, do 10%, and then multiply. Lots of choices. Maybe I'll do it both ways. So 30%, I'm thinking, okay, 10% of 90 is 9. I want 30%, which that means that's 3 times as much, right? So 3 times as much of 9, that would be 27. But then 5%, if 10% is 9, 5% is half of that. So half of 9 is 4.5. So then I could add those together to find 35%. So again, that's just me kind of going about it in a different way. But what I could also do is use my calculator, right? And I could say, okay, 35% is 35 hundredths per 100 of 90. And I can multiply those. And I'm going to get the same thing as I did if I would have added those. 31.5. 31.5 is 35% of 90. Notice none of my answers should be percents because I'm looking for a percent of a number, and I wouldn't have percent is percent. 12% of 12, so maybe on this one I just decide to change this to a decimal, which is move my decimal 2 places to the left. So 12% of 12. And I multiply, and again, I know that 12 times 12 is 144. 2 digits behind the decimal there, so it'd be there. So 1 44 hundredths is 12% of 12. 60%, notice again, I could do 60% of 264, or I feel pretty confident in using 6/10. And then again, I know that I'm going to move my decimal 1 place. So this one isn't super simple for me because I'm going to end up with the decimal. And I'm not very confident in multiplying like that in my head. So I'm going to use a calculator eventually anyways. So either way I do that, I'm going to end up with 158 4/10. Is it reasonable? Well, I could check by saying, well, 50% or half of this is about 130. 60% is 10% more. That's more than 130. So it seems reasonable based on that. Okay, so now I have a decimal in my percent. Still, don't let that freak you out. That's still the same thing. If I convert this to a decimal, this is 37.5 hundredths. Divided by 100, I'm still moving my decimal 2 places to the left. So 37.5%, is still 375 thousandths times 16. So I can still use my decimal option. You just have to think about where your decimal is going to go. And I get 6. So 6 is 37.5% of 16. So again, yeah, don't let these decimals kind of freak you out here. We're just going to move it 2 places. So I get 82.5% is 825 thousandths of 400. Can maybe make an estimate, right? I know that 50% is 200. So we're going to have maybe about 120 more. So I can use my estimating to help me feel good about it. I multiply my calculator, I get 330. Oh, see now here, this is a tiny, tiny amount. We have 1/4%. So I could do, this is 1/4% of 900. Again, I could change this to a decimal. That's moving my decimal 2 places still. So I'm going to end up with, that's a small number because it's a small amount. Okay, so then I can multiply 1/4% times 900, and I get 2.25. Estimating again would be great. So if I know 1% of 900 is 9 because I move it 2 places, then I could find 1/4 of that. So I even could do 9 divided by 4, and you'd still end up with 2.25. Last one, a little variety with decimals in there. So then I'd have this as a decimal is 0.015, right? Because I moved my decimal 2 places to the left, times 220. So you have to be very careful, not just relying on a calculator, because sometimes you can write it in wrong. So then I get 3 3/10. Again, not very much because it's a tiny percent. Again, estimating would be great too. If I know that 1% of 220 is 2.2, then that seems reasonable because it's about half as much more. Okay, so no different here. We can still use our same two methods when dealing with percents that are greater than 100. One thing just to remember though, checking for reasonableness, if I have more than 100%, my answer should be greater than what I started with. So two methods. Again, I know 120% is 120 per 100. So I can use the fraction version, or I can use the decimal version, still moving my decimal 2 places to the left. It's the same as 1.2. So doing 1.2 times 75. So the nice thing is, again, you have options to figure it out. And no matter what you do, 120% of 75 is 90. Again, using your 10% is a great option too. Just knowing, well, 10% of 75 is 7.5. I want 12 of those. Notice, similar to this, except you've just altered one of the numbers. But, we all think about things differently, and that's awesome. So try these two and then come back and check. I'll write out both options of how you could do them. So 150 is the same as 150 over 100 times 20. We also could look at that, right? Get rid of those and say, well, it's 15/10 times 20. Well, I know that 10 goes into 20 twice. I'm looking for 2 of those, so I get 30. Same thing if I were to do the decimal. 150% is 1.5 times 20. Well, again, right? 20 times 1 is 20. Half of 20 is 10. I'm still going to end up with 30. 160%, 160 over 100 of 35. And again, we know those are just adding, multiplying by 10. So I can cancel those. And then I can look for, well, 1/10. And I could divide, right? 1/10. Then this would be 3.5. And I'm going to end up multiplying 16 times 3.5. So I get 56. Again, try it as a decimal. 160% is 1.6 times 35. And maybe you want to try out both just to check that your math, no matter what you use, calculator or your brain, that you're typing it in, it both works out. Read it back to yourself to see that it makes sense. 56 is 160% of 35. All right, a little analyzing graph because it's important to be able to read information and go from there. Refer to the graph. So if 275 students took a survey, how many can be expected to have 3 televisions in their home? So we have to look at, one full television is 5%. So this is the survey results. If 275 people did this. And there's another question over there. So let's see. So based on what we need to know for information there, it's important to understand we're looking for the percent of how many students have 3 televisions in their houses. So we just want this information, right? 23%. So if we want 23% of the 275 that took the survey. So I may change this to a decimal of 275. So 23% of 275 would be 63.25. So we could say about 63 people or students. Another one, we could suppose 455 students took the survey. How many could we expect to have more than 4 televisions? More than 4 does not include 4, so we want this row of information here. And so it gives us on the side, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 times 5% is 25. So we're looking for 25% of 455 Well, that would be, we could say 1/4 of 455. That is a resource for you. Or you could do 25% of 455. Again, a great estimate might be to change this to be something that is easier for you to work with, more compatible numbers. So I could even change this to 440 if that helps me, or 460, and round up numbers that are divisible by 4. What I end up with is 113 and 75 hundredths. So I could say about 114 students. So this video, I want you to think about, for your better understanding. Rewatch if you need to, watch somebody else's, look up other resources, but always focus on what I do know rather than what I don't know yet. You got this.